The scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly as Private Sarah Mitchell scanned the ruined streets through her rifle scope. Another routine patrol through this war-torn city, or so she thought. The crumbling buildings and debris-littered roads had become all too familiar over the past 3 months of her deployment. The distant echo of sporadic gunfire barely made her flinch anymore. But this patrol would be different. As her team rounded the corner past a bombed-out marketplace, a faint whimper caught her attention. At first, she dismissed it as the wind whistling through broken windows. Then she heard it again, definitely a cry of pain, but not human. "Hold up," she signaled to her squad, raising her fist. Her teammates froze, weapons ready, watching her with questioning looks. Sarah pointed to a partially collapsed building ahead. The whimpering grew louder as they approached cautiously. Through a gap in the rubble, Sarah spotted movement. Her grip tightened on her rifle, but what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Huddled in the shadows was a dog. Young, maybe a year old, with matted sandy fur. One of its back legs was badly injured, and dried blood caked its side. The poor thing was trembling, eyes wide with fear. Sarah had always been the one her friends teased for being too soft-hearted. Back home, she'd volunteered at animal shelters every weekend. Now, in the middle of a combat zone, that same instinct to help kicked in hard. But this wasn't just about saving an animal. There was something in those frightened eyes that spoke to her soul. "Sarge," she whispered, "we can't just leave her here." Her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Chen, studied the situation. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a slight nod. 5 minutes, Mitchell. Make it quick." With slow, deliberate movements, Sarah approached the injured dog. She spoke in soft, soothing tones, the same way she'd done countless times with scared shelter animals. "Hey there, sweet girl. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's tail gave the tiniest wag, but she stayed pressed against the wall. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a protein bar, her last one. The wrapper crinkle made the dog's ears perk up. Time seemed to stand still as Sarah held out her hand, waiting. Hunger finally won over fear. The dog limped forward, sniffing cautiously. As she took the offered food, Sarah got a better look at her injuries. They were bad, but not impossible to treat. The real question was, what would happen next? Military regulations were clear about strays. Sarah knew she was supposed to leave the dog behind. But as she looked into those trusting brown eyes, she knew she couldn't do it. This wasn't just about regulations. It was about humanity, about not turning your back on a soul in need, even in the darkest places. 2 minutes, Sergeant Chen warned, his voice tight with concern for their exposed position. Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. With gentle hands, she reached for the injured dog. What happened next would test her courage, challenge military protocol, and prove that even in war, compassion could survive if you were brave enough to fight for it. The distant crack of gunfire split the air. Sarah froze, her hands inches from the trembling dog. Her squad snapped to attention, weapons raised. The real question wasn't whether she could save this dog, it was whether they'd live long enough to try. Time was running out, and somewhere in the warren of destroyed streets, trouble was closing in. Sarah's heart pounded as another burst of gunfire echoed through the streets, closer this time. The dog whimpered and pressed against her leg, as if sensing the danger. Through her earpiece, she heard urgent radio chatter. Hostile forces were moving into their sector. "Mitchell, we need to move. Now." Sergeant Chen's voice was stern but not unkind. He understood. He'd seen the same look in her eyes that she'd had when they'd found those orphan kids last month. But war didn't care about good intentions. The memory of those children flashed through Sarah's mind. She'd spent weeks trying to help them, breaking every regulation in the book until they finally got them to a safe zone. Now, looking at this wounded dog, she saw the same innocent victim of a conflict that made no sense. "Just give me your spare bandage, Sarge," Sarah whispered, already shrugging off her patrol pack. Her squad mates formed a protective circle, scanning rooftops and windows. They'd been together long enough to know each other's hearts and to trust each other's instincts. Working quickly, Sarah wrapped the dog's injured leg. The animal stayed remarkably still, only whimpering softly when she touched the wound. Up close, Sarah could see old scars beneath the matted fur. This wasn't the first time this dog had survived something terrible. Contact, 2 blocks east. Private Rodriguez's urgent call sent everyone into action. The sharp crack of incoming fire sparked off nearby walls. Sarah scooped up the dog, ignoring its startled yelp. The animal was lighter than she expected. Too light. How long had it been since it had eaten a real meal? They moved as one unit, falling back through the ruins. Sarah's arms burned from carrying the dog, but there was no way she was leaving it behind. Not now. Not after seeing those trust-filled eyes. Besides, something about this dog felt different. The way it watched their surroundings, how it remained quiet despite its pain. This was no ordinary stray. Through the maze of destroyed streets, they made their way toward their forward operating base. Every few minutes, the sound of pursuit would echo behind them. Someone was definitely tracking them, but why? This was supposed to be a cleared sector. There's something wrong about this, Sergeant Chen muttered during a brief pause to catch their breath. No random insurgents would be this persistent. He studied the dog in Sarah's arms with newfound interest. What do you get yourself mixed up in, girl? The dog's ears suddenly pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. Seconds later, they heard the distinctive sound of a rocket-propelled grenade being launched. Down. Sarah barely had time to dive behind a concrete barrier, shielding the dog with her body as the explosion rocked the street behind them. As debris rained down, Sarah felt something metal against her hand where it pressed against the dog's neck. Hidden beneath the matted fur was a collar, and something else. Her fingers traced what felt like a small metal container. "Sarge," she called softly, "I think I know why they're after us." But before she could explain, another explosion lit up the street. Through the smoke and chaos, Sarah caught a glimpse of their pursuers, and her blood ran cold. These weren't the usual insurgents. Their equipment was too good, their movements too professional. The dog looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, and Sarah realized they'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple rescue. Whatever secret this dog carried had been worth killing for, and now they were all caught in the crossfire. The real question was, how far would Sarah go to protect this mysterious creature? And more importantly, would any of them survive long enough to uncover the truth? Time seemed to freeze as Sarah's fingers worked frantically at the metal container attached to the dog's collar. Her hands were shaking, both from adrenaline and the continuous explosions that rocked the ground around them. The dog stayed perfectly still, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Multiple tangos moving in formation. Rodriguez called out, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "These guys are definitely Spec Ops, Sarge. No standard issue gear." He returned fire, forcing their pursuers to take cover. The small cylinder finally came loose in Sarah's hands. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, with strange markings etched into its surface. Before she could examine it further, Sergeant Chen grabbed her shoulder. "We've got to move. Northwest corner has a tunnel system we used last month. It's our only shot." They ran through the burning streets, Sarah's arms aching from carrying the dog. The animal remained eerily calm, its eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Twice it growled a warning seconds before enemy fire erupted from hidden positions. It was almost as if the dog was protecting them as much as they were protecting it. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a collapsed wall, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. As they rushed inside, Sarah noticed something strange. The dog's injured leg was healing incredibly fast. The wound that had been bleeding just an hour ago was already showing signs of closing. "What are you?" she whispered, running her hand over the miraculous healing. The dog just looked at her with those knowing eyes, its tail giving a single wag. The tunnels were pitch black except for their tactical lights, the air thick with dust and the smell of old concrete. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and their footsteps echoed ominously. Sarah could hear their pursuers above ground, their movements getting closer to the tunnel entrance. "They're hurting us," Sergeant Chen said grimly, studying his tablet's map of the tunnel system. Every route except one is blocked or leads to a dead end. They knew we'd come this way. Sarah clutched the metal container tighter. Whatever was inside had to be incredibly valuable, or incredibly dangerous. The dog nudged her hand with its nose, then looked pointedly down one of the darker tunnels. Something about its behavior seemed almost human. A sudden explosion sealed the tunnel behind them, sending clouds of dust and debris through the narrow space. They were committed now, no turning back. Their tactical lights caught glimpses of strange markings on the tunnel walls, similar to the ones on the container. They seemed to glow faintly in the beam of the flashlights. "Those weren't there last month," Rodriguez whispered, his voice tense. "None of this makes sense. Why would Spec Ops be chasing a dog? What's really going on here?" The dog suddenly stopped, its ears perked forward. The healing leg now showed barely any sign of injury. The markings on the walls grew brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly light. The metal container in Sarah's hand began to warm up, vibrating with an energy she couldn't explain. Sergeant Chen raised his fist, signaling them to halt. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Strange echoes reached them, not the sounds of their pursuers, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. The dog looked up at Sarah, its eyes now glowing with the same strange light as the wall markings. In that moment, she realized they hadn't just found an injured stray. They'd stumbled into something that would change everything they thought they knew about their world. As they stepped into the chamber, the truth began to reveal itself, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover. The chamber before them was vast, its walls covered in the same glowing symbols that had lined the tunnels. But it was what stood in the center that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A perfect circle of light emanated from the floor, casting eerie shadows that danced across the ancient stone walls. "Holy!" Rodriguez's voice trailed off as the dog suddenly leaped from Sarah's arms. Its movements were now completely fluid, all traces of injury gone. The animal padded confidently toward the circle of light, its fur beginning to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. The metal container in Sarah's hand grew warmer, vibrating with increasing intensity. The markings on its surface began to pulse in sync with the symbols on the walls. She could feel it pulling her toward the circle, like a magnet drawn to its opposite pole. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed behind them. Their pursuers had caught up, but instead of opening fire, a commanding voice rang out through the chamber. "Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, hand over the container and step away from the artifact." Sarah spun around, her blood running cold. The speaker stepped into the light, a man wearing the uniform of their own military, but with insignia she'd never seen before. Behind him stood a dozen soldiers in advanced combat gear, their weapons trained on Sarah's squad. "Colonel Richards," Sergeant Chen breathed, recognition and confusion mixing in his voice. "You're supposed to be dead. The convoy attacked 6 months ago." The colonel's laugh echoed through the chamber. "A necessary deception. We couldn't let anyone know about our real mission here, about what we found." He gestured to the glowing circle and the dog, which now sat at its edge, watching the confrontation with unnaturally intelligent eyes. "She's not a dog, is she?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The pieces were finally falling into place, the rapid healing, the strange behavior, the advanced forces hunting them. "No, Lieutenant, she's not. And that container you're holding contains technology beyond anything you can imagine." The colonel took a step forward. "We've spent years tracking her, learning her capabilities. She's the key to everything. A bridge between our world," and he paused, a fanatic gleam in his eyes. "Well, you're about to find out." The dog, or whatever it really was, suddenly stood, its form beginning to shift and blur. The glowing circle pulsed brighter, and Sarah felt the container grow almost too hot to hold. The symbols on the walls seemed to move, flowing like liquid light. "Sir," one of the colonel's men called out urgently, checking some kind of device. "The energy readings are off the charts. It's happening again." Sarah looked at her squad, at the colonel's men, at the transforming creature before them, and made a split-second decision. Everything she'd been trained for, everything she believed in, hung in the balance. The container in her hand might be the most important object on Earth, or the most dangerous. The chamber began to shake, small stones raining down from the ceiling. The glowing circle expanded, its light becoming blinding. In its center, something began to take shape, something impossible, something that shouldn't exist in their world. "Now, Lieutenant," the colonel shouted, "give us the container before it's too late." But Sarah had seen the look in the dog's eyes, had felt its trust, its intelligence. Whatever was happening, whatever this creature was, she knew in her heart that the colonel wasn't the one who should have this power. As the chamber filled with otherworldly light, and the very air seemed to crackle with energy, Sarah faced the most important choice of her life. The consequences would reach far beyond this hidden chamber, beyond the war, beyond their world itself. And in that moment of decision, the true nature of their mysterious companion began to reveal itself. Sarah's fingers tightened around the container as the chamber erupted into chaos. The creature that had once been a wounded dog now stood in the center of the glowing circle, its form shifting between shapes, one moment canine, the next something beautifully alien, like living starlight given form. "Stand down, Lieutenant. That's an order." Colonel Richards raised his weapon, but his hands were shaking. The terror in his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't in control anymore. He never had been. The container suddenly burst open in Sarah's hands, releasing a spiral of light that wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. In that moment, images flooded her mind, countless worlds, ancient civilizations, a network of guardians scattered across the universe. She saw the truth about their mysterious companion, a being whose kind had watched over countless worlds, protecting them from those who would abuse powers they didn't understand. "She wasn't your specimen to study," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chambers shaking around them. "She was stranded here, wounded, while protecting us from something far worse, and you hunted her like an animal." The creature's true form finally stabilized, a being of pure energy and grace, its shape vaguely canine but composed of swirling lights and impossible geometries. When it spoke, its voice echoed in their minds, filled with both ancient wisdom and the friendly warmth Sarah had first seen in those brown eyes. "The container holds the key to sealing the breach," the being explained. "The same breach your military tried to exploit, not understanding it would bring destruction to this world and many others." Colonel Richards snapped, "Fire! Take them all down." But before his men could act, Sergeant Chen and Rodriguez moved in perfect sync, disarming the two closest soldiers. The rest hesitated, lowering their weapons as the truth of their mission finally hit them. The chamber's shaking intensified. Behind the glowing circle, a darker portal was forming, the breach the colonel's secret program had created. Through it, Sarah caught glimpses of nightmare creatures straining to break through, held back only by an invisible barrier. "The choice is yours, Sarah Mitchell," the guardian spoke in her mind. "The power to seal the breach requires a sacrifice, a willing heart to take up the mantle of guardian. But the path is dangerous, and there is no return." Sarah looked at her squad, at Rodriguez's encouraging nod, at Sergeant Chen's proud smile. She thought of all the wounded and abandoned souls she tried to help, of her need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Perhaps this had been her destiny all along. "I'll do it," she said, stepping into the circle. The container's light merged with her own being, filling her with power she never knew existed. Together with the guardian, they faced the breach. Colonel Richards made one last desperate move, lunging forward with a hidden weapon, but Sarah was no longer just a soldier. The power flowed through her, transforming her into something new, a bridge between worlds, a protector of both the seen and unseen. The breach sealed with a thunderous crash, the chamber symbols fading to dormant stone. When the dust settled, Sarah stood changed, her form now sharing the same ethereal quality as her companion. The war that had brought her here seemed distant now, replaced by a greater purpose. The humans must never know the full truth, the guardian advised, its form once again taking the shape of a simple dog. But they will need protection, guidance, and sometimes a reminder of their humanity. Sarah smiled, understanding at last. As her squad stared in amazement, she too shifted her form, becoming a second dog, still recognizably herself, but now something more. Together, she and her companion would guard the thin places between worlds, appearing as nothing more than strays to most eyes, but always ready to protect those who needed them most. Colonel Richards and his men were taken into custody, their secret program exposed and shut down. But in the years that followed, soldiers in war zones around the world would tell stories of mysterious dogs appearing in their darkest moments, leading them to safety, protecting the innocent with impossible courage and intelligence. And if some of those soldiers glimpsed something more in the dog's eyes, a familiar spark of humanity, a glimmer of otherworldly light, well, some stories are better left untold. Years passed, and the legends of the guardian dogs grew. Sergeant Chen and Rodriguez kept their secret, though they sometimes caught glimpses of their old friend Sarah patrolling distant battlefields and disaster zones. Their own unit became known for its humanitarian work, focusing on rescue operations and civilian protection. They never forgot the lesson Sarah had taught them, that true strength lies in protecting the vulnerable. The hidden chamber remained sealed, its ancient symbols now dormant. The military officially labeled it a collapsed tunnel system, but stationed permanent guards under the guise of unexploded ordnance protection. Colonel Richards and his core team faced court-martial, though the official charges mentioned nothing of other worlds or guardian beings. Some secrets, they all agreed, were better left in the shadows. On quiet nights in war-torn cities around the world, soldiers would share stories around makeshift campfires. They spoke of two dogs that appeared out of nowhere, one with sandy fur, the other with distinctive marks that reminded some of Private Sarah Mitchell's combat patches. The dogs never stayed long, but their presence always seemed to precede miraculous escapes or unexpected rescues. A young medic in a field hospital swore she saw them lead a lost child through active combat zones to safety. A reconnaissance team, pinned down by enemy fire, described how two dogs appeared from a strange light and led them to a hidden tunnel. Time and again, the stories followed the same pattern, hope arriving on four paws when all seemed lost. But it wasn't just soldiers who encountered the Guardians. Aid workers, refugees, and civilians caught in conflict zones reported similar experiences. Two dogs appearing in moments of crisis, their eyes filled with ancient wisdom and human compassion. Some noticed how they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, or how their forms sometimes shifted like starlight on water. But most simply remembered the feeling of safety they brought, the unwavering courage that inspired humans to be their better selves. Sarah found her new existence suited her perfectly. In her guardian form, she could do more good than she'd ever managed as a soldier. She and her companion moved between worlds, sealing breaches, protecting the innocent, and reminding humans of the light that lived within their own hearts. The war that had once consumed her life became just one of many conflicts she worked to heal, one rescued soul at a time. Sometimes, on special nights, she would visit her old squad. They couldn't see her true form, but they knew she was there. Sergeant Chen would leave out 2 bowls of water, and Rodriguez would tell his children stories about the bravest soldier he'd ever known, though he changed the ending, saying she'd gone on a special mission to help others around the world. The secret chamber's coordinates were eventually buried in classified files, its energy readings dismissed as equipment malfunctions. But the symbols that had once glowed there left echoes in the dreams of those who had witnessed the truth. They served as a reminder that beyond the boundaries of their ordinary world, extraordinary guardians walked among them, wearing the humble disguise of man's best friend. And so the story of the wounded and abandoned dog became something more, a legacy of hope, a testament to the power of compassion, and a reminder that true heroes come in many forms. For every lost soul in need of protection, for every warrior questioning their path, 2 mysterious dogs might still appear, leading them toward the light. As for Sarah Mitchell, she had found her true calling. No longer just a soldier, but a guardian of both worlds, she continued her endless patrol. And if you ever find yourself in darkness, look for 2 dogs with starlight in their eyes. They might just lead you home. Some say they're still out there, these guardians in dog form, watching over us all. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what we need to believe in.